Hello, everybody. Welcome back to our 5-day sprint on the crisis is the curriculum. And if you can see me and hear me, make sure you drop in a comment and let me know where you are joining us from so that we know that all systems are a check. By now, if you have been a part of the LinkedIn Live series, you know that the interface is just a little bit clunky. So we have to, get things going, right? So today I got a message from someone where they say, we love this topic. Crisis is the curriculum, but it's it's a little bit gritty. Like, how did you even think of this? And so I thought maybe I should begin by just sharing why is this series called The Crisis is the Curriculum. And part of that is that I think we have become very focused on our post-pandemic plans and how are we going to be leaders of the post-pandemic world. Everybody wants to rule the world, right? The way the song used to go. I've just dated myself, I know. But to be the leaders of tomorrow, you have to first be the leaders of today. And so the conversation that I'm having with all of you and with my guests, and I'm going to be bringing on today's guest, Andrew Bryant, shortly, is if we were to create a curriculum as we are moving through the crisis, what do we have to learn here and now that will then allow us to apply the same skill set, the same mindset, the same attitude to things post-pandemic, whenever that might happen, is something that we have to learn to do now. And so in yesterday's live, we talked about the concept of diversity of experiences, on how everybody is not walking through the same crisis. In some senses, the poem that I read yesterday was, it's the same storm, but we are not in the same boat. And that's because we are all experiencing the crisis very differently. And I see that there are 7 of you watching live right now. So I'd love for you to just let me know if you can see me and hear me in the comments so that we know that this thing is working. So yesterday we talked about recognizing the diversity of experiences that people are having as we walk through the pandemic and creating a culture, creating a structure where we recognize the inherent interdependence of our partners in the ecosystem, of the different employees that are playing different roles within the organization, and how a sum is not just the parts coming together, but the whole is something much bigger. It's much more synergistic. Rina, thank you for saying yes. So I know that this thing is working. So that's what we spoke about yesterday, diversity and interdependence. What we're going to be talking about today is a little bit more personal. We're going to be talking about this idea of self-regulation, self-awareness, and self-leadership. These are skills that are needed today and tomorrow. And when I introduced the live today, I said, hey, Julie, I see you, thank you. I said that people say, how can we have self-leadership in times like this? Can we even have that capacity and that agency, right? And I think that it's not that whether you have that agency, but that you have no choice. You have to exercise that agency now. And so it starts with self-regulation and self-awareness. And so one of the questions I have for you is, are you aware of what is your stress curve? Have you had time to think about what is it that is your trigger that sends you into a tailspin and makes you stressed out in the times that we are moving in? That's the self-reflection piece that's coming in, right? Are you aware of what anchors you when you are passing through a storm? Because this storm is not like it's here today and gone tomorrow. It's going to be there for a while. So having that awareness of what anchors us on any given day or any given moment is also a piece of self-regulation that we need to, become aware of. Another question that I have for you is, just where are you living right now? Some of us are living in the past. We keep reminiscing about the world that used to be. how we could go out and now we can't go out. And, there was a time when I was on a plane every other day, flying to different countries, doing these keynotes. Oh my God, now I'm home, I'm stuck. Others are living in the past, in the future. It's talking about what am I going to do when this thing changes? Someday it will change, and what will it be like then? But the curriculum at the moment is learning to be in the present and sit with the discomfort of the stress that you're walking through. Because escaping in the past or in the future is not going to change what's in front of you right now. And a very, very important skill of leaders in the age of disruption is to look at discomfort in the eye and say, I see you, I don't like you, but I acknowledge and accept that you are here. And then use that energy that you were generating to fight the discomfort, to start creating a new reality. Think of it almost as repurposing your energy in some ways, that acceptance and surrender to what is in front of you without escaping to the past or running away to the future, right? So that's a little bit that I wanted to share. I'm now going to invite our guest for today, Andrew Bryant, and let me bring him from the studio and add him to the stream. Hey, Andrew, welcome to the LinkedIn Live.
Hi, Tanvi. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's always good to see you. For those of you who don't know about Andrew, Andrew is an international keynote speaker. He's a best-selling author, and he's also a pioneer in the field of self-leadership. So I couldn't think of anyone better to have a conversation around how to lead ourselves through these trying times than Andrew. So, Andrew, if you were listening to me backstage, which I know you were, I am starting to feel like some people, not everybody, right? Some people are developing a little bit of learned helplessness. There are things that we can't change at all. Like I can't get out of the house right now. I can't fly even if I want. But there is a little bit of this learned helplessness that's starting to seep in some conversations that I'm observing. Would you be able to share with us what is this concept of learned helplessness and why is it so problematic?
Well, it's problematic for a lot of people with or without this crisis. The term learned helplessness comes from Dr. Martin Seligman in his book on learned optimism. And he realized that certain people saw the world in a particular way. And there's an easy acronym. It's the 3 Ps: personal, pervasive, and permanent. So when something happens, a lot of people personalize. And it sounds like this: why does this happen to me? Why do bad things always happen to me? So we hear that a lot in any situation. Then the pervasiveness, it's about everything. Everything is ruined, right? If you've got a puncture on the way to work, your whole day is ruined. Well, no, your whole day is not ruined. Your trip to work might have been delayed. And the last one is permanence. It's never going to change. Now, the interesting thing about this particular crisis is it would be very egotistical to say, why me? Because it's happened to everybody. It's a global phenomenon. So, people might say, oh, well, my wedding has been cancelled, or my holiday has been cancelled, or in my case, my speech has been cancelled. But it's not about you. It's about everybody. It's not about everything. It's about a limitation to our social contact. And it won't be permanent. We don't know when it's going to end, but it will end. We will look back at this time and remember it and probably regale our grandchildren with tales of being locked up during COVID-19. All right. So the opposite is it's not about me. It's not about everything. And it's certainly not permanent.
Yeah, like they say, this too shall pass. I was reading an article which I thought was very helpful, which said that, talked about how a grandchild in the future was talking to somebody who was 80, so they may have been a kid right now. So 80 years from now, this conversation is unfolding. And the child is saying, I read in my school books today that you went through COVID. And so the grandfather says, that's right. I was about 6 when I went through COVID. And so the child says, well, that must have been horrible because the history book said you were locked up, you couldn't go to the playground, you didn't have school. And that must have been horrible, isn't it, Grandpa? And the grandfather says, actually, I don't remember it like that. I remember it as a time when my mom stopped saying, I don't have time, come back later. I remember it as a time when we had a lot of family picnics in the living room. I remember it as a time when I spoke to my grandparents a lot more every day on the computer. And the point of it all was we are not just creating our future, which is what this conversation is focused on, but we are also creating memories, right? And so what is the type of memory we are creating that we want to give to our kids to then share with their grandkids? Is that's where I feel that this learned helplessness piece that you were talking about, that oh, it's me, it's everywhere, it's never going to end. Somewhere we need to break out of that frame. And I know you like talking about the frame a lot that we see the world with. So how do you break out of it? You've defined on what it is, but if I was sitting and saying, you know what, yeah, that's me, I'm kind of turning into this learned helplessness piece, what's the answer?
Well, I like your story about the grandfather puts all in perspective. I like to talk about legacy. I talk a lot about this when I'm giving corporate conferences to senior leaders. A lot of people start thinking about legacy in their latter years. What am I going to leave behind? But legacy is our daily choices, the things we do today, conversations that we have with our children or other people, the actions we take today will create a legacy. And realizing the choices we are making every day around the actions we take, the communications that we have will be a legacy. And so returning, you used the word in the introduction, agency, returning to some level of agency. The core of self-leadership is control, the control of our thoughts, our feelings, our words, and our actions towards our objectives. And you could track that back to Dr. Viktor Frankl in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, where he said the last of all human freedoms is the freedom to choose our own attitude. So we have agency over the way we see this. And anything that we do that gives us a sense of increased control allows us to feel more of this agency. And the more control that we perceive that we have, the less stress we have. So focusing on the things that we can do, and you mentioned a few of them, playing with our kids, communicating to people through mediums like this, and maybe developing a hobby, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, what is in your control? Rather than focusing on what we cannot or are forbidden to do, what is unsafe to do, focus on what we can do.
So one of our viewers, Reva, says, when my family is stressed out, it has an effect on me. So it sounds like even if I seem to have, I don't have that learned helplessness, and I've learned to, develop agency, the piece about our family and just seeing them, whether in our homes or from a distance, go through this. What's your advice to Reva? That's a good question, because I think some of us experience life beyond ourselves, right?
Well, Reva obviously has some empathy, and kudos for her for having empathy. The important thing about self-leadership is the me, not me boundary, right? I'm responsible for my thoughts, feelings, words, and actions. I'm certainly not responsible for your thoughts, feelings, words, and actions. You're an adult, you're in control. But when we enter into relationships, we begin to feel responsible for other people, when in fact we cannot be. We can only be accountable to relationships. When two people get married, they're not responsible for each other. They're accountable to each other. The problem is with family, we feel them inside of our locus of control. We feel them inside of our boundary. We know that our family has the capacity to push our buttons because they're so close, which is why we hurt the people that are closest to us. Now, it is a tricky thing to say, but we have to step back and say, they're grown-ups. They're responsible. I obviously care and empathize for them, but I don't necessarily want to enable them either. And having that strength to say, yeah, you can see it this way, but I choose to see it this way. And influence happens when we take personal ownership and we say, hey, I'm not going to be upset. And then that creates a positive ripple. But if you get bought into your family dynamics and they drag you down into the spiral, well, you need to throw out a rope and have somebody pull you back up. And a trusted friend and advisor might be useful for that.
Yeah, it's like they say, if you're trying to rescue somebody who's stuck in quicksand, you can't get into quicksand yourself.
Yeah.
You have to be.
It's easier said than done, with family, because, we've got years of those triggers and buttons being enforced. All right. I remember, even going off to university, I left home at 18, went off to university, went off to work after university. And whenever I'd spend a weekend at home at my parents', I regressed to being 12 years old again because they had a way of pushing those buttons. And I think many of us have had that experience. So, Reva, I empathize with your scenario. I saw on another chat I was on just before this that somebody's challenge was being locked in the house with his mother for this entire time. I empathized, but my mother and father are long past. I'd give anything to be locked in a house with them now. So the perspective piece again is, as annoying as your family are, they're your family.
That's right. That's exactly right. And I think that, learning relational boundaries and, revisiting how we thought of relationships is very much a part of the curriculum right now, because there's no running and hiding. It's very much. So, a part of a red thread that might exist between what you're saying in terms of, managing family dynamics, so to speak, is the fact that there are a lot of tough conversations that are needed to be had right now, and more so even in the corporate environment, as we start looking at how we are retooling ourselves to, for the shock of reentry, so to speak. And tough conversations is something that I think most of us are not good at, even when there is not a pandemic. We are conflict avoidant. We don't like, having this conversation where we have to, lay out the truth, so to speak. I mean, you and I are running that program Amplify Together, and one of the women was talking about, how do I deliver bad news to people in my team when we are reeling under so many things? And so, what's your advice on these tough conversations? Because again, if we can learn to have them now, we can learn to have them at any point in time, right? So what's your advice there?
Well, in short, because there's a number of layers to this, and if we take that red thread that we're responsible for ourselves, we're not responsible for other people, but we're accountable to them in terms of our agreement. So if we're having a tough conversation with a colleague or a subordinate, there is an accountability frame in terms of what we signed up for. But what helps during this time is something that the psychologist Carl Rogers coined, which is unconditional positive regard. So a Rogerian psychologist will always look at his or her patient with unconditional positive regard. What this means is the absolute belief that that individual has all the resources to solve their own problems and to live their lives. The challenge when we have conversations, we have these guilt trips. Oh, if I demote them, or if I let them go, or if I tell them the truth, they'll be sad, they'll be upset, and I feel responsible for their emotions. Well, that's actually faulty thinking, because that is seeing that you are more together and mature than they are, right? The conversation, many of us have had a situation where something happened and we were better off for it, right? We grew through that. We became better people. The very fact that we had that experience made us a better person. So you don't know anybody else's destiny. You don't know where they are on their learning journey. But if you hold them in unconditional positive regard, that you are going to be empathetic, but you are not going to be responsible for them. They have to be responsible for themselves, and they have the capacity to do that. This gives you the ability to have truthful conversations instead of getting locked into codependency and guilt about how you talk to people. right? So now is not a time to ditch empathy, but it is a good time to be real. This is the scenario. These are the things. I know this is tough for you. However, I have the absolute belief that you will find your way through this.
Yeah. I was talking to Wouter, who's the president of GE in APAC, and this was way before all this hit. And GE has had its own set of layoffs and disruption as they've gone through their digital transformation, which has had its ups and downs. And he was telling me that one of the things that really helps is when you already have that relationship of trust with your leader, right? Where you feel that my leader did everything that was possible to try and avoid some of these outcomes that I was looked out for. This fundamental human need to be seen, heard, and understood. And I think when you're using that word, I really like that unconditional regard for the other person, because when you treat the other person like an adult, chances are they'll probably respond like one. When you treat them with trust and a certain level of empowerment, they hold agency for themselves as well, versus collapsing into where we began this conversation: learn helplessness, woe is me, what am I supposed to do, it's yeah.
So a key part of self-leadership is to practice self-leadership as a role model and encourage others to take that self-leadership, right? Self-leadership is not selfish. By letting your light shine, you give other people permission to let their light shine. I'm paraphrasing from Our Greatest Fear by Marianne Williamson. And I think it's really important that we do that. And look, I think we're all a little bit on edge. I think particularly, I think things may have settled down depending where you are on the journey now. However, I think people are a little bit more sensitive, a little bit more edgy. I was noticing people getting triggered on social media. I noticed a particular story triggered me. I was just furious at the stupidity of some things that people were doing. And it was easy to get in, I was reflecting on, I'm getting drawn into this. I'm being antagonized. And by stepping back and having that unconditional positive regard and saying, they're doing the best they can in their circumstances, and I wish the best for them, stopped me being dragged into that negative cycle. Right? So just because I've been researching and writing about this for 20 years doesn't mean I don't get triggered, right? I mean, we're all, I'm in lockdown too, or circuit breaker as we call it here in Singapore. So I'm feeling the same emotions and fears and frustrations as everybody else. It's just having practiced that self-reflection, self-awareness, I'm able to catch it a little bit earlier and go, okay, I'm not going to operate out of fear. I'm going to operate out of abundance. And I certainly don't want to melt down on a Facebook Live. And I want to process my own emotions first and then communicate out to see how I can support others.
Yeah, we have another great question that has come in from one of our viewers, because now we are, this person calls them Support HP Pro Train. I'm sure they have another name, but that's what they go on by YouTube. And they say, how do you support your team today in a work from home environment, especially when you know that the outlook is bleak? And I think this is a really important question, because what we have been discussing right now is, handling yourself before you are handling others. But, leadership in a virtual environment is so tough because, like you were saying, we are all on the edge. We are all getting triggered by things that, maybe 3 months ago would not have sent us on a spin. But I know that you work with C-suite leaders, and then you're an executive coach. Someone comes and tells you, well, what can I do? I know the outlook is not good. How can I best support my team that is working from home? What would your suggestion be there?
Well, I mean, again, connecting that thread to responsibility for accountable to. You are accountable to your employees in terms of the contract. And your ability to support those or be accountable to those people depend on the viability of the organization that you're in. And so if you've shown trust and empathy along the way, you have met your requirements. And the horrible image for me when I talk to leaders sometimes is the U-boat, Second World War U-boat movie or submarine movie. There's always a scene where there's a torpedo hits the submarine but doesn't sink it. It just floods a compartment, or a compartment becomes radioactive. And there's always the scene where there's doors that lock each of the compartments. And there is a terrible challenge for the leader. Do I rescue this individual and sink the whole boat, or do I sacrifice the individual and save the boat? And sometimes this is the nature of leadership, is we have to choose the whole over the individual. Now, if we built relationship and trust with people, they will realize that those are the decisions that need to be made. Are they easy to make? No. But that's why you're a leader, right? Leadership comes with that level of responsibility and accountability. Now, the other thing is to have realistic optimism. The very question from your YouTube viewer was, things are bleak. Yeah, things are tough. However, the leader has to always have realistic optimism. Yes, things are tough now, but we will find a way out. We may have to let you go now. We may be able to rehire you. I don't know. Every situation is different. But the leader must maintain a realistic optimism, not a Pollyanna optimism. Everything's going to be great, because it isn't. However, we will get through this. And I think the conversation I'm having with people, and I think the conversation I would love to see much more on the global stage, is hope that this is an opportunity to fix some things that are absolutely awful with our management of the planet, of our management of our country, the short-term view that we've had on business, that everything's been about the quarter and not about the sustainability of the business. A lot of the businesses that I'm coaching have been very empathetic towards their clients, because they know, well, we might be able to keep the business going, but if our clients don't have cash in a quarter's time or 2 quarters' time, they can't buy our product. So I was coaching somebody very recently who's, is in a sales function, but his focus had been, how do I create, as much as possible interest-free finance for my clients so they can continue to buy my product? So this dance between manufacturer and distributor and consumer, we are all interlocked. If there are no consumers, there is no business. So there's real hope and optimism here that we can start re-looking at the business relationship and how we use resources. And those are the conversations I'm enjoying having. Yes, it's easy to, as I say, BMW, which stands for bitch, moan, and whine. So we can have a BMW, or we can be hopeful and say, okay, what comes after this? What can we do now that will be our legacy moving forward? And that's the strategic thinking of leadership.
Yeah. So there's a comment from Sudeshna. She says, hi, Tanvi and Andrew, brilliant as always. It's so important to self-reflect in these times. I feel it's important to make my team realize we are in this together, even if it looks bleak. Empathy, trust is my motto, and I see it standing in good stead. Completely agree with Sudeshna there. I think the only thing I add to what you were saying, Andrew, there, is also that I think the view of leadership needs to change a little bit. I can understand someone feeling like I need to do something for my team, but if the team feels we are going to be pulling this thing together, maybe ask them what can be done to support them more, versus sitting in your, imagining in your head what is it that they really need. Meet them where they're at. I think people will tell you what they need. So this needs much more conversational space than has been there for this before. Priya says, not feeling guilty for the other person is important. Believing in their resourcefulness, demonstrating trust is what's needed. Great takeaway. That's exactly right, Priya. That is exactly what Andrew and I have been talking about. So Andrew, we are almost out of time here, but I would like to get into a slightly different take on this. As a coach on self-leadership, I know you spend a lot of time in self-reflection. How has all this crisis and pandemic and all of that shifted your perspective on things as an individual?
Well, I hinted a little bit about it earlier. I mean, I have, always enjoyed challenging people to, step back and think, challenging people to wake up and not be living a life of quiet desperation, to live a life of intentionality, because the core of self-leadership is living intentionally. And sometimes my style has been not abrasive, but a catalyst for change. And realizing that that style is not as useful in this environment. So my reflection has been much more about how we find that common ground. I think there is a real gap right now. We've seen polarization around the world, both politically and economically. And I'm looking for conversations around how do we close that gap? How do we bring it together? How do we balance it out? And I'm disappointed that on the global stage we're not seeing those conversations happening, or if they are, they're happening very quietly. So I'm interested in being part of that conversation. How do we look for that gap to bring people together, socially, economically, politically, intentionally? Because in 1968, December the 24th, 1968, Apollo 8 came around the moon, and we got that first glimpse of planet Earth from space. We saw the surface of the moon, and it was called Earthrise. It's the most beautiful image that we've all seen. And the mythologist Joseph Campbell said we really should have had an epiphany at that time, because for the first time in human history, we truly got a God's eye view of our planet. And to paraphrase Joseph Campbell, and to put it in my own words, that should have been a moment to realize we are one tribe on one planet with one future. And COVID-19 has certainly reminded us that we're all in this together, that, color, race, gender, ethnicity, orientation, politics, economics, we're all into this together. So having those conversations around closing the gap are what I'm reflecting on right now.
And I love this. Carl is saying, love this, Andrew, intentionality is key. And I think I couldn't end this live on a better note than one planet, one tribe, one future. What a fabulous, thought to take us to the future with hope. So once again, Andrew, I am so glad that you joined on the live. And I'm gladder still that we are friends, because I really value these conversations that we are having on the live as well as off it.
My pleasure, Tanvi. Good to see you.
And for everybody who's watching, please join me tomorrow, as we are going to be having another conversation around crisis. Is the curriculum? What is it that we need to learn now? If you have certain questions that you think I should be exploring with thought leaders, drop me a comment on LinkedIn or YouTube. I'll be happy to look into it. Tomorrow also, we are doing something extremely special, which I am fairly certain has not been done on LinkedIn before, but I cannot tell you what that is. But let me tell you, you will love it. So tomorrow, 8:30 p.m. Singapore time, 8:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, 6 p.m. Indian Standard Time. If you are free, I'd love to have you back in the live. Remember, we are doing a 5-day sprint here. And you will see a little bit of fun, which is slightly different from anything else that you have seen on LinkedIn before. So thank you for joining me. Love the conversation, love the interaction and all the questions that came in. And on that note of one planet, one tribe, one future, I will see you tomorrow. Bye.